Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
The U.S. Commerce Department's Bureau of Economic Analysis recently released its revised U.S. space economy statistics for 2012 through 2021. The new data builds on previous estimates that were released in January 2022 by incorporating new source data and improved methods. And I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Tina Highfill back to the Ex Terra Podcast. Tina, it's great to talk with you again.
Hi, Tom. Thanks for having me.
It is absolutely my pleasure. So let's just jump right in here and find out what's new in this year's report and how is the space industry doing?
Great. Thank you. So new this year is 2 additional years added to our analysis. So our previous report covered 2012 through 2019. In our report that we just released, we now have data for 2020 and 2021. So we're able to see what happened in the space economy over the COVID period. Generally speaking, what we found is that the COVID pandemic didn't impact the space economy as much as the overall U.S. economy, but it also didn't see the same rebound. And so in 2021, we saw that growth in gross output, which is very similar to revenue, grew about 4% for the U.S. space economy. The overall economy grew about 13%. With that said, a lot of this growth is inflation, so increases in prices, not necessarily increases in things produced. And so I think that the big takeaway there is that we are seeing growth in the space economy, but a lot of that has to do with increases in prices, so inflation.
When you talk about inflation, and that obviously is something that your numbers come up through 2021, and the inflation really hadn't kicked in at that point. And so as a general rule, what kind of impact might this inflation have that we're seeing now on the space economy?
Well, if inflation continues to grow, then of course, this will impact the space economy to kind of drag down growth rates to see a contraction. So when we adjusted for inflation for the 2021 numbers, we saw that we had a growth go from 3.9% to actually a contraction of 0.4%. So meaning all of the growth that we were seeing in 2021 was related to price increases. And so if that continues, then we would expect for that trend to continue as well.
When you look at the falling costs of launch as well, does that factor into these things as well? The fact that it's getting less expensive to get into space?
Absolutely. That has a lot to do with what we see in manufacturing. So launch is going to be part of manufacturing in the way that we produce our statistics. And we have seen that launch costs have declined drastically since we've started tracking the space economy since 2012. And so if you are thinking about costs, if these companies are taking in less money, then we're going to see a decline in output. Of course, if there's an increase in demand, then this might offset a little bit, but we're not seeing that happen. So these the declines in prices for launch in particular are actually resulting in less growth overall because we don't have that offsetting and an increase in demand just yet.
So as a general rule, what sectors of the economy does the commercial space industry participate in?
So the way that we produce our statistics is by type of industry, either private or government. So I know there are different definitions for commercial, but the way we think about it is whether a product or good or service is produced by a government employee or by a private employee. And so if you think about commercial space in terms of private industry, what we see in our data is that the space economy really impacts almost all the sectors in the economy. So the major sectors are manufacturing and information. So this is things like, space vehicle manufacturing, satellite manufacturing. In information, we see satellite television is the major player there. But other industries you might not think about are construction. So there's construction of spaceports that's been happening, and that's an industry that is small but is growing. Additionally, wholesale trade is a big part of the space economy. Wholesale trade relates to the distribution of goods between businesses typically. So if you think about a car manufacturer or a cell phone manufacturer, if they want to put a GPS transmitter into your car or cell phone, they'll typically go to a wholesaler to do that. They won't go directly to a manufacturer. And so wholesale trade is a big part of the space economy as well. And so it's really, in finance, so there's space insurance. So if you really dig deep, you'll see that space products are really part of essentially every sector of the economy.
So this is the third year of the report. Has the BEA made a lot of changes to the way information is processed and gathered?
We don't have major changes to our the way that we process and gather the information. So the way we do it, just generally speaking, is at BEA, we measure the overall economy by tracking production of goods and services. And so when we're thinking about the space economy, we essentially pull out from this list of what's produced in the United States, what are the space goods and services. And so that's been consistent for all three reports that we've put out. The major changes have been in presentation of our statistics. So we initially had detail on about 23 different industries. We've expanded that to include 10 more industries, so a little bit more detail. And I think most notably is we've broken out the government industry so that we can now see what is the contribution of the national defense sector, as opposed to we originally just had a total federal government industry section. And so we're just trying to expand this presentation over time.
When we first talked, what has it been, 3 years ago now, the space sector was a satellite account at BEA. Yes. Has that status changed? Are they really starting to begin to take the space economy seriously?
That's right. It's still called a satellite account, which I know is confusing. We have we have at BEA we have our core statistics like GDP, the trade deficit, compensation, and then we have what are called satellite accounts. And so these are supplementary statistics to these core accounts. So we have a space economy satellite account, we have a digital economy satellite account, et cetera. So it's really just complementary sets of statistics. And within satellite accounts, we have kind of different types. So the first two reports that we put out on the space economy satellite account were more kind of research, experimental estimates. The idea was to kind of get our methodology founded, get feedback from data users. So now we've kind of moved into a more official phase. So we have funding now through our budget.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And so the idea there is to create these the space economy statistics with more industry detail to make it look more like all of our other releases and to get more on a regular schedule. So we anticipate putting these statistics out every year, as opposed to in the past, you may know, we weren't sure if we were going to continue the project. So we're trying to make it more official and to get on more of a standard production cycle.
And who is the audience for the reports?
We have a few different user groups. So researchers, of course, are interested in, so academics typically are interested in understanding how the space economy has changed over time, what industries contribute, for example. And we also have policymakers, so folks in government, politicians who are interested in kind of similar things, but typically more about the more real time. What is the most current? What are your current numbers, and what does this look like? How does this impact the overall economy? And then we also have international data users who, so I work at a statistical agency for the United States. Most developed countries have their own statistical agencies. And so we've done some outreach with folks like Eurostat. They're kind of an equivalent to the BEA over in Europe. And they're interested in putting together a European space economy satellite account. And so that's kind of more of a research style interest as well. So there's a lot of different data users that we have for these statistics.
Over the past 10 years, the space industry has only grown at a compound annual growth rate of about 1.8%. But we've been seeing more flights than ever before. Now, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but is this due to the falling cost of access to space? Or are there other factors that your data is showing that are impeding the kind of rapid growth that we might have seen in the past?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right about launch costs. That's absolutely true. Launch costs have declined over time, which, as I mentioned, that will result in a decrease in growth rates if we're not seeing, an increase in demand, an offsetting increase in demand. But with that said, the major factor with the relatively slow growth in the space economy has to do with the information sector and specifically satellite television. So satellite television is a dominant part of the space economy, but it's shrinking over time as people have been cutting the cord and as folks in rural areas who used to have to rely on satellite television now have access to video services over broadband, over the internet. And so we do see, because of this contraction in satellite TV and how dominant it is in the space economy, that's really dragging down growth in the overall space economy. So that is the biggest factor.
It will be interesting to see as you continue to gather statistics how the transition from satellite TV to satellite internet changes those statistics, because more and more people are going to be getting that entertainment through a Starlink or another type of satellite service that's delivering their broadband.
You're right. You're exactly right. So the FCC tracks internet usage by type, whether it's broadband or over the phone or satellite. And the most recent statistics they've shown through 2021 is that internet received from satellite is only about 1 to 2% of total internet usage, which is so low. You imagine that there's room to grow there, assuming that the satellite internet is going to be able to compete with broadband and other types of internet.
Now, space, as we all know, is a very fast-moving industry. It seems like every day there's a new innovation, something changes. So what's the value of seeing statistics that you're putting out that are already more than a year old?
That's a great question. So I'll just start by saying that the data may not necessarily be useful for everybody, but what it is useful for is to have a benchmark to understand how the space economy contributes to the overall economy. Even if it is 2 years old, it's still important to understand how that has changed over time. And because BEA uses a consistent framework, you're able to look at our growth rates and to know that these are, we measure the space economy the same way we measure the overall economy, which is really important for researchers and policymakers to understand that, even if it is a couple of years old. But then I'll also note that there is the potential for data users, private industry groups to use our most recent data, so 2021, for example, and to use their own estimates of what they think has happened in 2022 and to forecast using our data as a benchmark, knowing that we use this consistent methodology to develop these statistics.
But as the investment people always say, past performance is perhaps not indicative of future results.
That's true. And just to be fair, the reason why the data are lagged is we pull from data sources that, it takes time to gather and collect, and government spending is a big part of the space economy, and getting information on government spending, there is a bit of a lag there. And so if we were to try and guess or forecast and to try to create more current statistics, the downside there is that there's the potential for large revisions. And so the data may become unreliable if we do it that way. So that's kind of the reasoning behind the lag in our data.
Tina, we talk often about the effect of the space sector on the overall economy, but I want to flip that on its head and see kind of what the feeling is about the overall economy as it stands today on the space sector.
Mm-hmm. That's a tough question. I mean, you hear about space all the time, and we see these launches and this move from government to commercial in terms of companies like SpaceX and things like that. And so for the space economy, it represents about half of the U.S. economy, which is relatively small. And so I guess what I can say is that if the overall economy we start to see an increase in demand for things like launch or space products, the use of remote sensing software, things like that, that would impact the space economy and it would allow it to grow. But who knows what the future holds?
I'm talking with Dr. Tina Highfill from the U.S. Commerce Department's Bureau of Economic Analysis on the Ex Terra Podcast. Take a moment right now to click subscribe to be sure you don't miss any of our podcasts, or if you're watching on YouTube, any of the videos from Ex Terra, the Journal of Space Commerce. Let's get into a couple of specific things here, Tina, because manufacturing seems to be really strong in the report. What aspects of manufacturing are the bright spots?
Mm-hmm. That's right. When I was talking earlier about gross output, so again, gross output is similar to revenue. We have two measures of gross output. One is in current dollars, and so that includes inflation. And then one is called what we call real or chain dollar gross output. And so this removes the impact of inflation. And so when economists talk about real growth, we're typically talking about growth minus inflation. And this is relevant specifically for space manufacturing. If you look at the current dollar growth, you see kind of a flat growth rate. So you don't see a lot of movement, but when we remove the impact of prices, we see that there's a lot of growth. And so what that means in layman's terms is that prices are declining for space manufacturing products. And this is across the board in P&T equipment, satellite manufacturing, ground station manufacturing. And this reflects some of the innovations that have happened in this sector over the period that we're studying, 2012 to 2021. So there are things like increased productivity due to things like 3D printing, or just, kind of learning from the past. There's been a lot of R&D in the space sector, which has kind of infiltrated and manifested into lower costs for production. And so with space manufacturing really is, I think, the bright point of these statistics.
On the other side, the information and wholesale sectors seem to be weakening in this year's report. Beyond what you've already kind of discussed, what factors may have contributed to that decline?
Right. So we talked about satellite television with people cutting the cord, but in addition, so not only are people cutting the cord, so there's a decline in number of satellite TV subscribers, but prices are also increasing. And so those two things really draw down the growth rate in the information sector. So people are leaving and prices are increasing. Wholesale trade is a bit different. So when we talk about wholesale trade, I mentioned earlier, this is related to distribution of goods, typically from a manufacturer to another manufacturer. And so wholesale trade is really just the markup that wholesalers get from making that trade. And so we don't really, it's kind of a mystery if you're just looking at our current dollar wholesale trade estimates, because if you see growth, you might think, okay, is this an increase in the distribution of goods, or is the wholesaler just increasing their prices? And so that's the real value of our inflation adjusted statistics, because we can see while wholesale trade is growing in current dollar terms, it's declining in real terms, which means that we're seeing a decline in space-related goods being distributed. What we don't know is whether that's because there's a decrease in demand for space goods. So this is typically going to be the GPS P&T equipment that I was referring to earlier, which is in so many of the things that we own today. So we don't really know if this is a decline in demand, or if maybe supply can't keep up with demand. So it's really, with wholesale trade, we know that there are less things being distributed, but we don't necessarily know why, if that makes sense.
And you mentioned that supply can't keep up with demand. Are you seeing any kind of trend that would say what kind of affects the supply chain issues that kind of began back at the end period of your report are having on the space economy?
I really don't have details on supply chain demand and supply. This is something that I can note that another agency in the Department of Commerce, the Bureau of Industry and Security, they're doing a survey specific to supply chain for the space sector. And so because this is such an important issue, the supply chain, it's not just what's happening in the United States, it's how much we rely on overseas producers as well, and kind of how reliant we are on that global supply chain. And so all I can say is that I'm really looking forward to the survey. It's coming out in early 2024, which should give us some good indication of what's going on with the space supply chain.
I hope you'll pass that along to us
Sure.
when it becomes available, because
Absolutely.
I'd sure like to see that as well. Let's get down just a little bit into the weeds, because the report states figures of gross output and value added. What is the difference?
So gross output is similar to revenue. So a company sells a satellite, they get revenue for it. That's very similar to gross output. There's some differences, but that's, they're essentially the same. Gross output and revenue are very similar. Value added removes the value of inputs into production. So that satellite manufacturer they probably purchase screws, they probably purchase metal to make the body of the satellite. When we talk about value added, we remove the value of the inputs so that we are only measuring the value that's added by that industry, hence the name. So if you just subtract gross output, if you subtract value added from gross output, you'll get the value of the intermediate inputs used into that value. And that's relevant for productivity growth. So if you're interested in looking at how has productivity changed for an industry, you really want to just focus on how much has that industry contributed to that final product. And so you probably would want to be looking at our value added numbers versus gross output. But we tend to highlight gross output in the space report because we know that our space data users are used to looking at revenue from other reports from like Space Foundation or Satellite Industry Association, but both statistics are valuable, I think.
Now, the space economy obviously is about more than things. It's about people as well. And when I talk to companies and CEOs for this podcast, we almost always talk about the employment situation. How is that looking in your most recent analysis up through 2021? Are there enough workers? Are there enough qualified people? What does the employment situation look like in the space economy?
Well, in 2021, we saw a decline in space economy employment. So it's about, in 2021, private employment related to the production of space goods and services was about 360,000 people. So that's full and part-time jobs. It's been between 360 and 370,000 over the whole time period. And the contraction was related to, as we've talked about, this decline in information, satellite TV, and also wholesale trade. So if there's less products being moved in wholesale trade, there's less employment, attached to that. And so I will say that we at BEA develop macroeconomic statistics. We don't necessarily drill down into the education or makeup of employment, but this is another good time for me to plug a project that's being undertaken by the White House, the OSTP, Office of Science and Technology Policy. They're really interested in space employment, and they're looking into using our numbers, kind of our total numbers, to drill down on what are the occupations, what is the gender and racial makeup of the space economy, to kind of understand what's going there and to help grow, the space economy employment, and specifically related to STEM employment. So that's something that I think is another report to look out for in the next couple of years.
Looking kind of down the road a little bit, and I'm not going to ask you to make any predictions, but are you looking at changes to the report next year? And along with that, have you heard from your stakeholders about things that they would like to see included in the report?
Yeah, we've absolutely heard from stakeholders about what they want to see. And the main thing is, when we talk about industries like manufacturing and information, this is how we typically present official macroeconomic statistics in the United States, and that's how it's done worldwide. But that's not necessarily how our data users think about the space economy. I don't think most people think about wholesale trade when they think about the space economy. And so one thing we're thinking about doing is trying to reorganize our statistics into activities that are more salient to our data users. So instead of manufacturing and information, we might have things like launch and R&D or Earth observation. It really depends on the data sources that we have, but that's absolutely something we're looking into to make it more kind of relevant to our space users. The other thing that comes up a lot is state estimates. So we have statistics for the US space economy. Especially policymakers, they're interested in understanding what does this look like for my specific state? And so we're exploring coming up with state level estimates as well. That wouldn't happen next year, but we might have some initial estimates out to kind of give some scope there.
I know that Space Florida puts out an annual report. I happen to live in Florida, and of course, the space economy is huge here. And they do put out an annual report about the impact on the Florida economy from the space sector. So that's that kind of research is already being done, and it might be a little bit more, less of a lagging indicator than what it is that you're able to glean coming back a couple of years.
Absolutely. Florida is, they have great information on their space economy, other states as well. California does as well, and New Mexico. And so that's absolutely where we'll be looking. If we want to come up with state level estimates, we won't start from scratch. We'll kind of look at and see what's already been done, because like you said, it really does vary drastically from state to state, how much the space economy impacts the overall economy for those states.
I want you to maybe not predict anything, Tina, but we do ask all of our guests this last question. But I'm going to ask you specifically about BEA's role in space commerce over the next 10 to 15 years. And how do you see the BEA's role as affecting what's going on in space commerce?
Well, what we do at BEA is we provide information, and it's consistent, nonpartisan information that is freely available for any data users. And so what we try to do at BEA is to put out high quality data to allow others to use it in whatever way they see fit. So we hope to continue to put out space economy estimates that are useful for our data users, and also to expand upon them and to change, like I mentioned, potentially having estimates by activity, information, other information people have asked for is trade, how much do we trade with other countries? Are we a net exporter, net importer? And just trying to continuously give more information to allow our data users to, have the information they need to understand what's going on in the space economy over time. So the idea is to hope to continue to expand and improve upon that strategy.
Is there enough awareness of the fact that this data exists and is available to the public, or is there some education that still needs to be done in the space sector to say, hey, we've got all this good data here, you might want to look at it?
Well, this is one of our more popular data sets that comes out of BEA, but with that said, I don't know how popular BEA is in general, and so it can't hurt to do these outreach events. And thank you so much, Tom, for having me on to kind of highlight what we're doing here, because I do think it's important, and the people who do know about our statistics really seem to see a lot of value from it. And so with each release, I put it on my LinkedIn account, BEA tweets about it. And so we're starting to see a lot more interest. And I think one of the things that we mentioned is the data lag. We're trying to, as much as possible, put the data out quicker so that it can be more relevant, because I think sometimes, up until a couple of months ago, the latest data we had was 2019. And of course, a lot's happened since then. And so if we can just get right. And so if we can continue to accelerate and expand and make these statistics more salient to our data users, I think it'll become even more popular and useful.
Tina, we are out of time. Thanks so much for joining me again. It's always a pleasure to speak with you.
Thanks, Tom. Appreciate it.
Dr. Tina Highfill is an award-winning research economist with the U.S. Commerce Department's Bureau of Economic Analysis. And that is going to do it for this edition of the Ex Terra Podcast. You can subscribe to the audio version of the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Audible, and many other popular podcasting platforms. Be sure to click on subscribe so you don't miss an episode of the podcast or any of our other videos. You can also get daily space commerce news at exterrajsc.com. And one thing more, be sure to connect with us on LinkedIn and follow us on Twitter at exterrajsc. Until next time, I'm Tom Patton. Thanks for joining us.
I wanna go faster, faster. Hands in the air, we're gonna crash. Searching for the answers like Galileo through his looking glass. That's for reason. Our dreamer's eyes we gaze into a sense of purpose, known by view. Like finding water on the moon.